Good afternoon, classmates. This is Bill Cope coming to you from Virginia Beach, Virginia. The case comparison that I'm going to discuss this afternoon involves the two hostage barricade situations, one at the Dubrovka Theater in Moscow, Russia in October of 2002. The second one, the seizure of the Japanese ambassadorial residence in Lima, Peru by the MIRTA of the Tupac Amaru guerrilla organization, terrorist organization. In Moscow, it was the Chechen separatists who seized the Dubrovka Theater. The siege lasted approximately 57 hours. The decision of President Putin to use special forces, specifically the FSB Alpha Group and the Spetsnaz, to retake the theater, resulted in the death of all 40 Chechen terrorists and the loss of 129 hostages, and we'll talk to that momentarily. In San Isidro, the neighborhood in Lima where the Japanese ambassadorial residence was located, is an interesting case study there as well. That involved a smaller force of MIRTA terrorists, approximately 14, who were able to infiltrate and attack simultaneously that party, which was being held for the Emperor's 63rd birthday at that time. So that's just a quick background of those two incidences. What's interesting is the length of time of both hostage barricade situations. In Moscow, it was 57 hours and 129 days in Lima before President Alberto Fujimori launched the attack to retake the compound. Looking at the leadership aspects, it's very interesting. Dichotomy, if you will. Peru, a fairly robust democracy, which has in place certain checks and balances, certain freedoms, specifically freedom of the press, for example, as compared to Russia, where Vladimir Putin, yes, he's an elected president, but it's essentially an authoritarian regime in Russia, where, for example, mass media, a lot of that is controlled by the government. As a matter of fact, a large majority of the mass media is state-controlled, and that comes into play during the Dubrovka Theater seizure. As we talk about leadership, both presidents came into power basically saying that they had controlled terrorism in their country. Putin with the Chechen wars and Fujimori with the MIRTA terrorists. As we look at the strategic platform going forward, we see that the use of the risk resiliency framework was more evident with the Peruvians. The political fabric in Peru at that time, one of the main aspects of that political fabric was the Japanese diaspora in Peru. Of course, President Fujimori is of Japanese descent. One of MIRTA's demands when they took the ambassadorial residence was that the government stop showing favoritism towards Japanese business interests in the country. In Vladimir Putin's case, he moved aggressively against the Chechens, not one war but two. This one, of course, on the heels of the earlier war in the 2000s. The Chechens demonstrated to Putin that they were not kept in their box, if you will, in the North Caucasus. If you look at the hazards that the Russians did not recognize, they did not come to grips with the fact that indeed the Chechens had freedom of movement. They could use the Russian infrastructure to move their force, a large force of 40 individuals, to include women, from the North Caucasus to the center of Moscow to engage in terrorist activity. So leadership-wise, both presidents were really put on the spot. And then their crisis communication flowed from that. Fujimori was an excellent use of deception in his case. Putin used deception as well, but he also kept a clamp on the information that was going out. Of course, he was in a more compressed time zone, or I'm sorry, time period. Fujimura had time on his side. What was interesting here is that Fujimura, again using the risk resiliency framework, they were able to reinforce the ambassadorial residence. They had actually 300 security guards at that party that night. It was structurally reinforced because they felt the threat from Murta was real. Unfortunately, they did not show really good preparedness on the ground because of the ability, one, for some of the terrorists to infiltrate as staff members for the party, and two, the ability of the other part of the team to breach the outside wall of explosives and make entry into the compound. Going back to the Dubrovka Theater, what was interesting here was, again, caught off guard by the arrival and the ability of these Chechen separatists to gain entry into the theater and to take many hostages. The point about the Chechens is that they had demonstrated previous ability to do this and a previous proclivity to be successful at it, both in 95 and 96 in Russia proper, the southern part of Russia, and then in Dagestan as well. They took many hostages and were able to either escape or negotiate their way out of it. What has happened in the strategic platform and the emergency planning for the Russians, which became their modus operandi, is that regardless of situation, if they felt that they had a modicum of success or a chance of success with an armed assault, they would take it. In earlier incidences, that proved to be quite fatal. In Dagestan, the Alpha FSB, Elite Anti-Terrorism Force, actually quit in the middle of the fight because they could not continue the engagement. So they assumed great risk in that aspect of the emergency management planning. Conversely, Fujimura and the Peruvian government, they recognized that the structural integrity of that ambassadorial residence not only was intended to be a protection for the ambassador, but it turned out to be a combat multiplier for the Murta terrorists, because the Peruvian government had to do extensive planning to include the infiltration of surveillance devices, small cameras, and microphones into the embassy, as well as an extensive tunneling operation from outside the embassy as two avenues of approach for their assault forces. Looking at the tactical situation on the ground, both the Peruvian and the Russian forces were able to establish both inner and outer perimeters. Both governments established lines of negotiation, again, part and parcel to their communication plan. An example of how these two interplayed was Fujimura professed, of course, searching for a peaceful solution, working towards a negotiated settlement, when actually within days he had made the decision that an armed assault was going to be launched and that the terrorists would not get away. In Putin's case, he immediately moved to that option. He was, and the forces there, it was a different, of course, situation. It was not a secure compound, it was in the open city. It was during a musical production there that the Chechens moved in on. Their force structure, to include armed men, they had also females, suicide bombers, who were placed in the auditorium among the terrorists. The demands of the Chechens were, of course, the withdrawal of Russian troops, and one of their negotiating points was if there was ever an attempt at an assault, they would kill all the hostages. What was interesting in San Isidro, again, was the longevity of the event. The terrorists actually became quite complacent. Part of Fujimura's crisis communication plan was to actually leak the fact that they were planning an attack, and that and then he could deny it with the intent, of course, of kind of maybe playing a double blind, that they would leak it, deny it, but it was actually undergoing as well. Well, leak it, take responsibility for it, and deny it in an attempt to confuse the terrorist. As we move forward and we look at the overall structure of the emergency management response, again, a study in contrast. The Russians displayed their modus operandi, which is can say impatient when it comes to the tactical and operational decisions on the ground. The Peruvian government showed extreme patience. Fujimori understood from his advisors that his forces were not prepared for that type of an attack against that type of a hardened facility. The Peruvian Special Forces have demonstrated excellent leadership in training and preparing their troops to recapture. In the incident in Dubrovka Theater, what initially took place as tactical success, and I think we all know this, with the initial introduction of the aerosol spray, the fentanyl spray, into the theater to both shut down the terrorists and the hostages at the same time prior to making entry. Initial tactical success, it worked. There was about an hour-long firefight. All the Chechens were killed. However, what happened was the hostages were continually exposed to that aerosol spray. The evacuation took time, and as a result, 129 hostages were killed due to the spray. Crisis communication there, it fell apart for Putin at that point. He had to do a lot of explaining. What was the type of the aerosol, what type of gas was used, why weren't proper emergency evacuation personnel in place for the mass casualties, as it turned out to be. They did not have that in place. We look at the San Isidro assault, much more proficient, much more well planned. They came on two avenues. One was through the tunnels. The other was the use of breaching explosives on the wall to move in and to kill the 14 terrorists, free the 72 hostages, and the Peruvians lost 2 special forces troops in the attack. So at the end of the day, these 2 hostage barricade situations were similar in many respects of the actual actions on the ground. The use of special forces, the use of surveillance and the crisis communication plan that was deceptive in nature, the strategic platform. More strength there goes to the Peruvians than to the Russians in this case. The Russians underestimated the tactical and operational capability of the Chechens, again, to use Russian infrastructure against them. The Peruvians caught off guard initially, but again, they were quick to recognize what they had on their hands, and they prepared accordingly. I believe both governments acted well within the sovereign rights of their country to protect themselves against armed assault. I think that the Peruvians proved much more successful at the end of the day. One of the controversies controversy that still holds forth today is that the accusation that the Russian Spetsnaz and FSB Alpha Group summarily executed the female hostage takers while they're seated in their auditorium seats following their disabling by the gas. And then in the Peruvian case was, again, the execution of terrorists who allegedly were trying to surrender. So that's in a nutshell those two hostage barricade situations. I appreciate everyone, and all the best to everyone as they continue to move through the program. Thank you very much.